these are notes for the quiz. Can we use these on the quiz, Mr. Tonic?
Probably not.
Probably. Yeah. So my scoutmaster, back when I lived in Illinois, he was in Vietnam. And I worked with him building pools. I didn't really know a lot about it until one day he started talking to me about it. I know that he had a Purple Heart, which is an award you get when you've been wounded in combat. And he ended up telling me the story. Dan was a squad leader, so he was probably a corporal at the time. He was in charge of a group of soldiers, and they were on patrol. One day, this young kid, he's like 18, one of the soldiers finds an ammunition box, which is a green box with ammo on the side full of bullets, right? And he ends up opening up the box. Now, yesterday you guys talked about how the Viet Cong would booby trap things. You guys talked about that?
Yeah.
Viet Cong would booby trap things, and this was one of those booby traps. What they had done is they took a grenade, and they had a stick on top of the handle. And what that does is it keeps it from exploding until the handle's released. So when he opened up the box, it released that pressure on the grenade, and it exploded. The box was filled up with all sorts of metal. Anything they could fit inside the box, they stuck it in there. Ball bearings, which are just little metal balls, or knives and forks and pieces of airplane that crashed. Whatever they could stick in there, they stuck in there. So the kid who opens up the box, just as Dan goes, "No!" It explodes, and the kid got ripped in half and he died, which is unfortunate for him. Everyone else standing around the kid gets filled with shrapnel. The ball bearings, the knives, splinters from the box just explode in every direction. And Dan ended up getting wounded from his knee up to his neck, and just laying there bleeding from like a million different wounds. And he ended up they got found by another patrol, pulled back, and Dan spent the next several months in a hospital getting pieces of wood pulled out of him. When he told me this, I was like, "Oh my goodness, and you survived? That's insane." And Dan doesn't have like wounds or scars or anything. But one day while I was working with him, he had like this pimple, and he was like scratching at it. And he was really like scratching really hard, and he ended up pulling out a little piece of wood. He was like, "Here, Chris, here's a little piece of Vietnam for you." And I was like, "Thanks, Dan." Yeah, so that's my little story about Dan. Dan was crazy. Of course, he was a Marine, so he was like super tough, and not always a fun guy to work with.
He just ripped it out of his arm.
Yeah, he had all sorts of little things, like still little pieces, very, very tiny pieces. All the big ones he would pull out. And the biggest one was about that big, and his stuff in his gut area. So that's a little personal story about Vietnam for me. And talk to your grandpa or your dad or your uncle or someone you work with, and I bet you they have all sorts of crazy stories. So we're going to talk about a little bit about what happened before the United States got really involved in Vietnam, but pretty much from the end of World War II to the 60s, the United States was involved in some way. So we're going to start by talking about this guy, Ho Chi Minh, really friendly guy. What can you guys tell me about Ho Chi Minh?
He needs to eat.
What?
He needs to eat.
He needs to eat? Yeah, well,
Looks like a turtle. His name means one who enlightens.
Yes, Ho Chi Minh wasn't his born name, but he took it on. It means one who enlightens. How do you spell Ho Chi Minh? Ho, C-H-I, Chi, Minh, M-I-N-H. One of the interesting things about Vietnamese as a language is it has very few words with more than one syllable in it. One of my friends told me who speaks Vietnamese. Now, before World War II happened, since the 1800s, Indochina was controlled by France. Indochina contains Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. It was controlled by France until World War II, when the French left and the Japanese came in and conquered Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh was one of the many people who escaped the Japanese to live in China, and he was in China during 1945, 1940s, and eventually when Japan pulled out of Vietnam, he steps forward with a group of people and declares Vietnam as this independent nation. He created an organization called the Viet Minh, after his name, Minh. And they were an organization that was aimed at getting rid of foreign rule. Japanese, French, they wanted to see Vietnam controlled by Vietnamese. Okay, any questions about the Viet Minh? It's important, Viet Minh, I almost turned in a paper for that Vietnam class where it was completely written Viet Minh like 40 times in my paper and mixed around the letters. And it was, spell check got it wrong. I was like, well, of course it got it wrong. It's a crazy Vietnam word. Okay.
Hold on.
So here's a map of Indochina. Here we have actual China, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand. And this area right here is the Gulf of Tonkin, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But you guys already filled out the map, right? Everybody did their map? Kind of. So, after World War II, the Japanese lose control of Vietnam, and the French reclaim Vietnam. They wanted to have it as a colony. It had been part of their empire for a long time after that. Why do you think the French would want Vietnam? Yes. The coast? Yeah, it does have nice beaches. Yes?
Trade with China.
Trade with China. It has open access to China, a lot of the Pacific. If you saw the bigger world map, you have Japan, you have the Pacific Islands, and it'd be quicker to get things to Europe than over land. Any other reasons they might want Vietnam?
They don't really have much resources, do they?
Vietnam?
Yeah.
They have a lot of trees, so it might be a little. They might have resources.
Who doesn't have reasons? Is it China? Does it have much?
Japan.
I think there's more to have a foothold in the Pacific, because the Pacific has a lot to offer. It's the same reason why we have Hawaii and things like that. Now, during this time, after 1945, 1950s, President Truman supported the French in the war. President Truman supplied them with money and financial aid, mostly because he wanted to put a stop to communism. That's one of the big driving goals of the conflict in Vietnam, is to fight communism. The idea was if Vietnam became communist, well, who's next? Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, India? I mean, it could just become this whole tumbling dominoes. They talk about the domino effect. Right here, the domino theory, that countries can fall to communism like a row of dominoes. Where else have you seen the domino theory today?
The states where one state passes a law,
Sure. A lot of state laws affect other states. Yeah, that's a great example. In the Middle East, potentially the domino theory, which at one time was disproved, a lot of people thought after Vietnam that it was just a silly idea. But now we're starting to think about it again with Tunisia. Remember Tunisia? That was the first country to start doing these protests and overthrowing their dictator governments. And then it moves on to Egypt. It's moved on to Libya. It's moved on to Yemen. Moved on to...
There's been some bouts of Saudi Arabia. I think Algeria is another one, I think.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like it's catching. And that was the concern about communism, was that it would catch and spread throughout these weaker countries. So, eventually the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, end up ousting the French at Dien Bien Phu, which is right here, which is a fort. And that's when the French kind of give up, as they often do. They end up signing the Geneva Accords, which divides Vietnam at the 17th parallel. Can I see the map pulling up, please? This right here is the parallel, the demilitarized zone, or the DMZ. Korea has a demilitarized zone. And Dien Bien Phu is right up here in the north, right next to Laos. Okay. Now, the idea was that after the Vietnamese cast off the French, they were going to have free elections that would unify the country in 1956. Now, Ho Chi Minh was in control of the northern part of the country, and he had a repressive regime, but it was popular with the peasants, which is where it really counts. And the south was controlled by an anti-communist president whose name is Ngo Dinh Diem, right here, Ngo Dinh Diem. And he refused the election that would create one Vietnam. What ends up happening is we, the United States, end up supporting Ngo Dinh Diem. Not because we particularly liked him or liked any of his politics, but because he had a strong stance against communism. And that's a big motivator for a lot of the presidents who end up supporting Vietnam. It wasn't that we were particularly interested in what was going on in the country, it was that they didn't want to look weak or soft on communism. And we liked the idea that he wanted to get rid of all the communists in the country. So we promised him military aid, we promised him financial aid, all in the hopes that he would keep this country from falling to communism. But what ends up happening is Diem, who we thought was a really cool, nice guy, was not. He was actually very corrupt. He was big against anyone who would try to oppose him, like newspapers. He controlled the media very tightly. He also had a big thing against Buddhists. And there's a huge Buddhist community in Vietnam and in the region, because Thailand's right there. And there are a lot of Buddhist monks, but he would actually took a lot of actions against them because he was Catholic.
What was one of the things you guys picked out of the pictures yesterday? Monks burning themselves. Now you don't.
The monks would set themselves on fire to draw attention to this issue, and it worked. It made its way to the United States, and people began to get concerned about the guy we were backing. And the reason they did this was because he was arresting Buddhist monks, killing Buddhist monks, destroying temples. Now, what ends up happening during this time is the Indochina Wars, right? The Indochina War?
Mm-hmm.
Not the French Indochina War. The Indochina War is just between Ho Chi Minh's forces, the Viet Minh, and Ngo Dinh Diem. Now, what Ho Chi Minh and his officer soldiers would do is they would come down through Cambodia, down what's called the Ho Chi Minh Trail. He likes his name a lot, so he names a lot of things after himself. And they would make strikes against the South. Instead of having to march through the South, they just kind of went around. Okay? What ends up happening is the formation of the Viet Cong. And you hear the Viet Cong or the VC used a lot when you talk about Vietnam and the Vietnam War, because the Viet Cong were a group of communist soldiers. This is what we were talking about with the Viet Cong being battle-hardened, because many of these people had already fought the French during the French Indochina War, and now they are fighting the South Vietnamese for years before the American GIs show up. And they were guerrilla soldiers, mostly designed to attack and kill high-level officials, to mess up the command structure of the South Vietnamese. Okay. Ready for the next slide? Now, the United States, we slowly eased